Hello everyone, thank you for joining me today on this review of a cash transaction HUD. My name is Anna, I'm from Bright Title Services, and we will be going line by line on a cash transaction for buyer and seller. As you can see, it is very simple and we're going to get right into it so that we can get all the information that we need today. Here you will notice that you will have the name of the borrower, seller, and property location. Okay, so all your information here, you will notice you will have it here. Is omitted for right now just for the protection and privacy of the client. If we continue to go further down on this HUD, you will have a settlement date and a disbursement date, which normally would be the same date, okay, on the cash transaction. All right, so let's get right into it. There in this HUD, we have page 1, and we have page 1 on the left hand side. Here it is a buyer side. All of this here is a buyer side, and then on the right hand side, you will see the seller information. So we're going to start with line 101, and line 101 will give you the cash or the purchase price, the sales price. And line 401 will be on the seller side, the same exact thing. In this case, line 103 is going to give you a total of how much your buyer closing costs came up to. Okay, that is the total of the transaction. And line 104, in this case, is an insurance credit. Now we do not prorate insurance. The only thing that we prorate on a transaction is the property taxes or the HOA maintenance and special assessment. But in this case, the contract was already negotiated to a buyer to give the credit to the seller. Okay, so that's what you will see in that section. As I continue to go down on this HUD, we're going to go through section 106 to 120 on the buyer side and 406 to 420 on the seller side. Now this says adjustment for items paid by seller in advance. This means that the seller already paid it in advance, so now the seller needs to get a credit, right? So the seller paid the HOA assessment for April already, for the month of April, in advance, and also the special assessment. Right, so now the seller is going to get a credit of $133 for the HOA maintenance and $45 for the special assessment. The buyer has to actually be debited because they have to give the seller a credit in this case. So the HOA assessment is being right here in this section debited from the buyer, credited to the seller. Okay, so this is where you will see the section of a debit from the buyer, credit to the seller. As I continue to go down on this HUD, line 120 is giving you the sales price plus what the buyer has paid. In this case, the buyer has paid the $28.91 and the two debit and credit. The debit from the HOA assessment and special assessment. All right. Now this section here, 200 to 209. 500 to 509. On the buyer side is 200 to 209, and the buyer right here is just showing you how much money your buyer has in escrow. This is a deposit. This is a credit towards your buyer. Why? Because your buyer already put down a deposit, an escrow deposit. In your case, whatever your contract states that your buyer give, this is where you will see your escrow deposit. If you notice that on the seller side, the seller doesn't have an escrow or any $5,000 because this has nothing to do with the seller at the moment. This is a credit to your buyer. If I go down to line 202 and 502, 202 on the buyer side, this is for loans. We don't no longer use a HUD for loans, so that's why you will not see anything here. And of course, this is a cash transaction, as I mentioned earlier when I started the video. Now line 502 on the seller side is the total of what your seller is paying when it comes to this whole transaction. Any commission, any taxes, or anything that your seller, we will go over in the next page, itemized, but this is the tally of the total of what your seller paid for this transaction. As I continue to scroll down, we have a section 210 to 220 for the buyer, section 510 to 520 for the seller. This is an area where the adjustment for items unpaid by the seller. Okay, so now, like I mentioned earlier, this section up here, the buyer is debited and the seller is credited, right? So anything that the seller paid in advance will be prorated in this section. This section here, the buyer is credited and the seller is debited. What does that mean? That the seller will have to pay whatever he hasn't paid yet to the buyer, and the buyer will be credited. So in this case, the buyer has to be credited the taxes for the year. Remember, please let your clients know that the property taxes are paid in arrears. So for the year 2020, we do not know what the taxes are, so we will have to collect the taxes, okay, from an estimate from last year. Always remember that the taxes will be different if your owner is primary resident and they have exemptions. But if they do not, then yes, the taxes will be full. And maybe for the next year, if your buyer is is purchasing as primary, then their taxes will be cheaper. But in this case, from the first day of January till the closing date, it is the seller's responsibility to credit the buyer so that when November comes in 2020, the buyer has enough money to pay for the taxes for the year. Okay? Now, I will continue to go down to line 220, and line 220 is the credit that your buyer has. In this case, your buyer has a credit of $5,000 from the escrow deposit, and the credit that the seller gave him for the property taxes. Okay, so that gives you that total on line 220. And line 520 is how much the seller what is due from the seller. The seller had the settlement charges of $25.81 plus the debit that he gave over to the buyer for credit. You have a total of 21. All right. So here it just tallies up all the numbers, and on line 303 is your buyer's cash to close. This is how much your buyer will be wiring to the title company for the closing of the transaction. Line 603 is the total that your seller will be getting at the end of the transaction. We're going to skip right along and we're going to go to page 2 so that we can kind of get the itemized on what your total was on page 1. So these are the itemized transactions. Now, line 700 is just giving you the sales price at whatever percentage you negotiated with your client for your commission. So this is a commission section, right? Normally there are 2 different realtors in transactions. So normally the commission is 6%. In this case, this realtor represented both buyer and seller. He negotiated a 4% commission with his client, so he's only getting 4%. Normally you will see 2 different brokers, and we will itemize the commission, 3% for the buyer realtors and 3% for the seller's realtor, or whatever total you negotiated. As we continue to go down to line 704, there's a transaction fee. In this case, the buyer pays a transaction fee to his client, to the broker, and so does the seller. As we continue to go down, we have section 800. Don't be afraid if you see this section 800, section 900, and 1000 all blank, because back before the new TRID and the new CD came out, we used to use this HUD as a settlement statement for a loan. But in this case, we do not use that anymore due to the TRID regulations. So now we don't have to worry about that. So that would be empty. And as we continue to go down, we have section 1100, which is title charges. Here you will see all the title charges and the fees. The settlement closing fee for the buyer, because now you have to remember that in page 2, column 1 to the left hand side is for the buyer, column 2 to the right hand side for the seller. Okay, so this is how you will see the fees itemized. Column 1, we have on the left hand side on the buyer is responsible to pay their settlement charges. And line 1102, depending on how you executed the contract, if the buyer or the seller chooses title company, or you have the Miami-Dade borrower provision, which is automatically to the seller is responsible to pay the abstract and title search. If you have a contract and your buyer chose title company, your buyer is responsible to pay the title abstract search. Okay, please keep that in mind. All right, as we continue, 1105, which is the document preparation fee for the seller. That is the seller's fee, and he is responsible to pay that. 1108 is the title insurance. The title insurance is a regulated fee by the Florida Department of Financial Services. That is not a fee that we put, and it depends on the sales price. Okay, that is dependent on the sales price. And the endorsement for a condo will be 1111. Now, if you see pay line 1109, if there was a mortgage, again, this is not a mortgage transaction, you will see the premium for the mortgage. All right. Now we're going to go to section 1200. In section 1200 is the recording fees. Okay, that is the recording of the deed, the recording for the recording of the deed, how many pages were recorded, and also for the doc state stamps. And the seller is responsible, okay, to pay the doc stamps. And again, it is regarding, when it comes to the doc stamps, it is based on the sales price. All right, that doc stamps is based on the sales price. So the more the sales price is, the higher the doc stamps are. That's just the logic of it, and that is how it has been established. All right, 1204, in this case, there's a power of attorney that needs to be recorded, and we're recording that, so we're charging for the recording of the power of attorney. All right, the last section here is section 1300. These are just additional settlement charges. This is where you will see all the additional charges like lien surge, estoppel, wire courier fee, things of that nature. In this case, this client had delinquent taxes for the year 2018 and 2019. So the seller, we have to collect from the seller. And we have an additional because there were more charges or settlement charges that needed to be collected in this case for the special assessment that we prorated, that I said that was paid in advance in page 1. Here I collected the full amount. Here you have the HOA due for April with late fees because, of course, if it's 4/21 is late, so we're collecting it right here. But special assessment, and we're collecting it from the seller. So what I did was I collected the HOA and the special assessment from the seller here in full, but on page 1, I'm going to go back to page 1. I gave him a credit for it because he paid it in advance. So now at the end of the day, 4/21, the buyer has to pay the seller, give the seller back a credit for what he has paid. So that's what that is from. And I'm going to go back down. And as you can see, this is where that is the end of the HUD. There is nothing else here. But this is how you can kind of get a gist of what cash HUD is. And if you have any questions, we are always available here from Monday to Friday, 9 to 5 at Bright Title Services. You can always reach out to us and give us a call. Thank you so much for your time and for listening to this HUD review. Thank you.